All right, let's get started. So next week we will do another classic debate. We did a classic debate. We did two classic debates so far. We did Habermas and Lyotard, and we did T.J. Clark versus Michael Fried about Greenberg. And now we're going to do our third classic debate, which is Roland Barthes and Michel Foucault on the author. So that will be one half of the class next week, and the other half of the class will be Krimp's The End of Painting and Rosalyn Krauss's Originality of the Avant-garde, a Postmodern Repetition. Anyone want to present on our next installment of postmodernism? Okay, no volunteers. That's okay. You guys have probably presented already. And we have such low turnout today. I don't know what's going on. Are people massacred by some flu or COVID outbreak? What has happened? No. Huh?
No idea.
No idea? Yeah. All right. So for this week, we're talking about, we're going to introduce the concept of postmodernism in a variety of ways. We're going to introduce it before it really had a name in terms of the fine arts. And I wanted to just sort of flag a couple of things. So when we read Habermas and Lyotard on postmodernism, what we found was that Habermas saw it as a post-60s phenomenon, very much. He distinguished between the old conservatives, the new or neo-conservatives, and the young conservatives. And the young conservatives were the postmodernists. They were the people that he had in mind with respect to postmodernism. And Lyotard responded to Habermas defending the honor of postmodernism, but also tracing it back at least to the early 20th century and maybe to the very origins of modernism and modernity itself, namely the mid-19th century. So earlier in the course, we were reading Greenberg, as well as T.J. Clark and Michael Fried in debate over Greenberg's legacy, and Greenberg sort of by the by in towards a newer Laocoon mentions that Gustave Courbet is the first avant-garde painter and Edouard Manet is the first modernist painter. So there's a distinction made there between the avant-garde and modernism that may or may not make sense. So the way we kind of defined it was that Manet was the first modernist painter because he's the first painter who's doing painting about painting, whereas Courbet's avant-gardism is really about questioning more fundamentally the place of painting in society, and therefore the place of the fine arts in society. Now, what we're encountering here, starting this week, is a little bit different. So the postmodernist Lyotard, who we encountered earlier, his lineage for postmodernism is the 20th century avant-garde, and the 20th century avant-garde's roots in the 19th century. So when we think of the 20th century avant-garde, we're thinking of Dada and Surrealism. Those are kind of exemplary cases. And what gets introduced with Dada, especially, less so with Surrealism, but also with Surrealism in its own way, is the anti-aesthetic or anti-art. So the avant-garde as somehow making a gesture against art itself. In our first week, we read from Susan Buck-Morse's response to the visual culture questionnaire in the October Art Journal. And she was sort of taking issue with visual culture as a new discipline, as an interdisciplinary discipline, because she thought it liquidated art. And she brought up a couple of things. The artist's work is to sustain the critical moment of aesthetic experience, commenting on the way we live now. And the critics or critical theorists' role is to recognize this, to recognize how the artists are doing this. Otherwise, art might be driven underground. But she also pointed out that in recent decades, so in the 90s, recent decades would be 70s, 80s, 90s, but especially in the 90s, that artists found themselves caught in a dialectical cul-de-sac, namely a self-contradictory dead end, in which to sustain the idea of art meant attacking the institution that maintains the illusion that art exists. So attacking the museum, attacking the gallery, dealer, critic, museum system that she talked about, that produces and maintains the value of art. Now, we're not going to get there this week exactly. We're going to introduce some things that might start us along the road to the attack on the institution of art. We're really going to get there in the final week, in the crimps on the museum's ruins. And we'll get into it a bit next time with The End of Painting by Douglas Crimp, one of the key October writers. Less so with Rosalyn Krauss's sculpture in the expanded field this week. The Originality of the Avant-garde, though, by Rosalyn Krauss also, will kind of start to get a mounting of the attack on the museum. And what Buck Morse had in mind, she's a contemporary of Douglas Crimp and Rosalyn Krauss, she's a baby boomer, is how artists attacked the museum in the context of the Vietnam anti-war movement. And we have a little bit of that voiced in the editorial statement on the October Journal, launching the October Journal. So they did what people do now, which is that they attacked the museum and other institutions, such as universities, for their complicity in the military-industrial complex. So the fact that there were people from military industries sitting on the board of trustees of museums and schools was what students took issue with. So students made protests at their local institutions, namely their universities and colleges, on the basis of those institutions being implicated in the Vietnam War. Artists do the same thing with the museums. And what you're dealing with in that environment is sort of institutionalized modernism. So MoMA modernism, like Museum of Modern Art modernism, which is really a post-World War II phenomenon. So just to sort of date things, periodize things historically, just want to remind us. So if we have Romanticism becoming realism, circa 1830, and modernism, circa 1848. Then we have the period of high modernism in the period at the end of the 19th and early 20th century. Then we have a crisis of modernism. In World War I and the revolutions that follow. And so out of that crisis, we get the 20th century avant-garde. We get late modernism. We get mass culture. And political art. whether fascist or communist or liberal democratic. So like works progress administration style art and the depression. So these are our remnants of what might not have been so delineated, distinguished in the period of high modernism. And so we're thinking of it in these terms. We'll see how important this is. So for instance, the Armory show in New York before World War as like the height of high modernism. And then everything after that, there's a kind of change of direction. And we've previously addressed the fact that modernism and realism are pitted against each other in the 20th century, especially with respect to like liberal democratic art and socialist or communist art in the Stalinist era, socialist realism based on bourgeois realism circa 1830. It looked at what Marx and Engels liked in terms of literature, Charles Dickens, and also some of the writers. Say, okay, that was the height of bourgeois art and literature, and then after that we have decadence, we have capitalist decadent bourgeois culture and art, and that's what they associate with modernism. We've dealt with the Frankfurt School, their, like Adorno and Benjamin in particular, their defense of modernism as really inseparable from the realities of capitalism, meaning it's its own form of realism. Surrealism, as a 20th century avant-garde movement of the post-World War I period, is not meant to be other than realism. It's meant to be an authentic form of realism as opposed to a kind of a kitsch, kind of naturalized kind of realism. So by the time we're getting into the post-World War II period, really, it's quite late in the game with respect to modernism. So it's fully institutionalized. Picasso's Guernica is put on the wall of the UN Security Council, established after World War II. So Picasso's Guernica, which is about the Spanish Civil War of 1936, and when the Nazis invade France and occupy France, and they go to Picasso's studio, and they see Guernica on the wall in his studio, and they say accusingly, "Did you make that?" And he said, "No, you did." They mostly left him alone. So the 60s generation rebel against this. I will also say we read Greenberg's modernist painting from 1960, so his kind of post-Marxist take on modernism, which is appreciably different from his take in avant-garde and kitsch and towards the newer Laocoon. So Greenberg has become a kind of a fixture. He's a kind of very prominent art critic. He helped make the careers of some of the abstract expressionist painters. In the 1950s, during the Cold War, the United States government sponsors something that's known as the Congress for Cultural Freedom. And they basically say that the West represents freedom against the communist East. And how can you show that the West is free as opposed to the East? Well, look, we have like radical, experimental, free, modernist art, whereas in the East they have a stifling, bureaucratic, socialist, realist, kitsch aesthetic, and they repress and oppress artists for varying from that official style. And Greenberg's part of that. The Partisan Review that we read, we read Trotsky's Art and Politics in Our Epoch, a letter to the Partisan Review, and Greenberg's Avant-garde and Kitsch, and his Towards a Newer Laocoon, all published in the Partisan Review. that becomes a kind of Cold War liberal or Cold War social democratic, kind of conservative defense of the West, Western civilization journal after World War II. You'll recall Greenberg's modernist painting. He says the West, like Western civilization. That wasn't like his category in the 1930s when he was a Marxist. We've talked about Fried being a student of Greenberg, whereas T.J. Clark was a student of Meyer Shapiro, another Marxist critic, but with a slightly different slant on things than Greenberg. Now, Daniel Bell, who we read for today, who was he? So Daniel Bell was mentioned by Habermas. He was the exemplar of the neoconservative as opposed to old conservative or young conservative movements. Daniel Bell had been a graduate student research assistant of the Frankfurt School when they were at Columbia University. So he worked closely with Horkheimer, Adorno, other people in the Frankfurt School. But in the 1950s, he was famous for announcing what he called the end of ideology. So he said that the Cold War actually was not the ideological struggle that it purported to be, that the old ideologies of the 19th century, liberalism, socialism, nationalism, were dead. Socialism in the broad sense, including communism and anarchism, that all these ideologies were dead, and that what had happened was the world had entered into industrial society, and that the Soviet Union and the United States had more in common than they differed. They were basically industrial societies rather than really exemplifying some kind of battle between capitalism and socialism. It's like, no, that's all over. It's called the convergence thesis, the idea that East and West were converging. They were more similar than they were different, and they were similar at the level of industrial society. What we read from in Modernism and Capitalism, so he has two books that he published in the 1970s. One is The Cultural Contradictions of Capitalism, and the other is The Coming of Post-Industrial Society. So he saw the 60s as already anticipating a post-industrial society, meaning a society where automation would eliminate a lot of manufacturing jobs, and those would be replaced by like service sector and intellectual labor jobs, and that this would be a crisis for capitalism. So he sort of anticipated a lot of what was going to happen with neoliberalism. Although, like a lot of people of the era, he assumed an economic growth curve, like a wealth production curve that was constantly going up. He didn't anticipate the slump of the 70s and 80s that took place and that we've more recently experienced in the Great Recession and also the COVID shock. All right, so he thought, like a lot of people in mid 20th century, thinking about society and politics and economics, he thought that the contradiction of capitalism as it had manifested in the 19th century was overcome. It was overcome through state management in the 20th century. It's the 30 glorious years, is what they call it in France, the 1940s, 50s, and 60s. From the mid-40s to the mid-70s are the three glorious decades, and that's the period of post-World War II massive wealth development increase throughout the world, by the way, not only in Europe and the United States and Japan, but really everywhere, the post-colonial world as well. The shock of the 70s hit all the countries of the world, but especially hit the third world very hard. And so you get the kind of third world poverty starting in the 70s that we're more used to, although even that has changed since the 90s. All right, so I mention all of this just because Bell is kind of a post-Marxist thinker, and Fried, in his own way, is a kind of a post-Marxist as well. There are a lot of kind of overlapping concerns there, and we'll see that these concerns that they have are also shared by Rosalyn Krauss and the October group in terms of how they look at just the basic assumptions about society informing their approach. Okay, so we're going to start with Fried, because Fried is going to give us a kind of particular case and a kind of detailed phenomenology of the condition of art and really aesthetic experience in the late 1960s. So the situation, he's trying to criticize the minimalist sculptors, or Donald Judd, the specific objects, but he's criticizing them not just for what they're doing, but criticizing them for what they exemplify about the moment. So they're taken up as a case that's meant to shine light on or illuminate the more general situation, and not only of art and its practices, its production and consumption, but also of, we might say, the subjectivity, the aesthetic experience, the subjective aesthetic experience of late capitalism, or maybe post-capitalism, industrial society, whatever that might be. Right. So just in the title, I think that we should pause on this distinction that he's making, art and objecthood, meaning the artwork is an object, but it's a special kind of object. It's not merely an object. It's a specific kind of object. The experience of the artwork is different from the experience of other objects. So just as we had with Susan Buck-Morss a distinction between art and culture, here we have a distinction between art and objecthood. Meaning, for a work of art to be a work of art, it has to, in some way, transcend its mere objecthood. Right, so the aesthetic experience of art is different from the aesthetic experience of other kinds of objects. And if we go back to Kant, you'll recall that Foucault and Habermas and Lyotard all invoked Kant, and we read Kant, that Kant has this idea of the subject-object dialectic, that it's not merely a thing, but it's an object. It's a practical and theoretical object, that one makes practical and theoretical objects out of the phenomenal world, out of the sensuous manifold, out of mere things, because remember Robert Pippin from the first week of class, that Kant revolutionized philosophy because he recognized metaphysical categories as being about the subject rather than about things or the world in themselves. So it's not about the world or things in themselves, but rather about how we make objects of the world, and that's inseparable from how we make ourselves into subjects, how we constitute ourselves as subjects. But art is supposed to be something very specific with regard to that. And what Fried is objecting to is the liquidation of art into mere objecthood, in the same way that Susan Buck-Morss was objecting to the liquidation of art into mere culture. So what an object is certainly is socially and historically, culturally specific. Objects are objects by virtue of our collective practices, which inform how we experience things. I bring this up because, again, he is trying to speak to not only the practices of certain artists, but also to the general cultural, social, and historical situation, which he says is dominated by what he calls literalness. And that literalness represents a diminution of our sensibility with regard to aesthetic experience. Now, his other category here, the opposite of literalness, is what he calls grace grace. Now that's a religious term, that's a theological term. In Protestantism, right, there's the question of grace, meaning it's by God's grace, including things like predestination. Are you predestined for heaven or hell? That's a matter of God's grace. So grace, as opposed to the literal experience of things, the experience of things as a phenomenon of grace, it's a theological category. And so the question is, what is its meaning now? What do we mean by that now? And from earlier in the course, you'll recall that we talked about how art descends from religion. Really, everything descends from religion. Everything descends from either religion or magic. So we read Benjamin's On the Mimetic Faculty, as well as the Experience in Poverty piece in terms of transcending culture. We also had the cult value as opposed to the exhibition value in the work of art in the age of mechanical reproduction. So art descends from, it transcends theology, and yet still is. Still is. Like philosophy is, like a lot of things are, it still is rooted in theology as a anthropological category. The difference between religion and magic is that religion is about the sacred. It's about the veneration and worshiping, respecting the sacred, preserving the value of the sacred, as opposed to the profane. Magic, on the other hand, is more engaged with the profane. It's about the instrumentalization of the divine forces of the world. That's why it always has the taint of evil to it, because it's about humans trying to bend the divine forces to our will, which usually doesn't work out well for us. Art is descended from both religion and magic. And science actually is descended more from magic than from religion, although it tends to try to square itself with religion. A lot of the things that we even still experience nowadays in terms of the demand that we go back to religion and that we not leave science with the final word over our values goes back to this ancient struggle between religion and magic. Meaning if we leave it up to science alone, that becomes a kind of demonic, infernal, evil force. We need a sense of what's sacred, which science can't give us. But art, in some strange way, does. Right, so I'm just noting this because part of what Fried is objecting to in terms of art succumbing to literalness and abandoning grace is that we are abandoning the kind of value judgments and indeed the faculty of judgment, but also the question of value in the realm of art, potentially. So this category of grace is meant to really call attention to that problem. Now, I'm not trying to set up poor Fried for a takedown, but Fried is a conservative in terms of his response to the minimalist sculpture. He definitely is having a conservative response. The question is, in what way might it be warranted? It's also important to point out that Donald Judd and others are not trying to be avant-garde. They're not really trying to be avant-garde. Meaning, are they trying to either insult the bourgeoisie? So we had Habermas remind us of what the content of the avant-garde is. He calls it the periodic Baudelarian surrealist revolt against bourgeois society. And he saw postmodernism as bound up in that, but he saw it as a kind of spurious radicalism that revolts in the aesthetic sphere but leaves everything else alone, leaves politics and economics, leaves society untouched. Tries to take on, at an aesthetic level, the methods of science but in a kind of strange, perverse way. Habermas reminded us of this. Lyotard responded by saying, yes, we have to be true to science in the sense that the surrealists thought that science was the most surrealist activity, right? Because it's about truth that might lay waste to our existing values. So, and it's about like the reality of reality. So Donald Judd and others are not necessarily trying to revolt against bourgeois society in that kind of radical way, let alone make kind of insulting gestures, appâter la bourgeoisie, insult the bourgeoisie. Don't necessarily have a political intention or bent to what they're doing. But that might be in the background when we think about modernism and the avant-garde and the question of postmodernism. Is there some intentionality here with respect to attacking the very category of art itself? In other words, is even if maybe not the deliberate intention of the artists, maybe that is the objective content of their work, is to challenge the very status of the artwork. So we'll see what Rosalyn Krauss does with that this week, because Sculpture in the Expanded Field, she's very self-consciously saying, okay, maybe these aren't sculptures in the sense of the history of art, the history of the art of sculpture, but maybe sculpture is being opened up along other cultural axes, right? So she's very self-conscious about saying perhaps things like the earthworks are not art in the sense of sculpture, but are cultural practices, rather. Right, so art and culture, art and life, art and culture, art and society. This tension in the modern era, there's in the modernist era and the capitalist era much more than in the bourgeois era, not in the Renaissance so much. Art seems to be defined by its opposition to life, or its at least problematical relation to life, to society, to politics, to the rest of the worldly reality. But they're not really intending that, but it might have that content, in which case does it become culture. So even if Fried is being a conservative, that doesn't mean that his critique is without merit, or without warrant, or without substance, without content. Right, so we can sort of question, is he doing justice to the artworks that he's criticizing? Maybe, maybe not, but maybe that's also not the point. Maybe the point is to speak to the larger situation of which he finds them to be symptomatic. Now, we'll also say that Daniel Bell, he's got an indelible phrase that I love, which is what's happened to art and culture in his time. Fried, I mentioned this when we read Habermas, Bell, when I mentioned this when we read Habermas, that Bell is a neoconservative, that neoconservatism, in terms of Daniel Bell, it's different from the neoconservative of more recent times, the kind of foreign policy hawk neocons. That's not what we're talking about. Daniel Bell's neoconservatism, which had a kind of a heyday in the 80s, and might still linger in the background. He defined himself as a socialist in economics, meaning he was for economic equality, distributive equality, a liberal in politics, which meant that he was in favor of political pluralism and the rights of minorities, and the rights of the individual against the majority, and a conservative in culture. A conservative in culture. So a socialist in economics, a liberal in politics, and a conservative in culture. But what he meant by being a conservative in culture was not like a traditionalist, not like some kind of religious conservative, but rather he wanted to conserve modernism, or the modernist classics. And we've encountered this previously in the course, the paradox of the idea of a modernist classic, or a canon of modernism. I mention this because Fried is also interested in that. In other words, Fried is also, as we read from his debate with T.J. Clark on Greenberg, and he picks up where Greenberg left off at the end of his modernist painting essay, where he said, I can't understand art unless it's about continuity and not just change. Fried's running with that. So if we recall how Fried talked about modernism, as opposed to T.J. Clark thought that modernism was primarily about how artists were responding to society and politics, even when they were rejecting society and rejecting the political sphere. Fried thought, well, no, that's an important context for art, but in fact, what makes artists artists is how they're responding to art history, how they're responding to the practices of art of their time and the history of those practices. So people don't become artists simply out of a response to society and politics. They become artists out of a response to art, meaning they're inspired by art to become artists. They respond to art in making their work. Right, so Fried emphasizes art history as the driver, whereas T.J. Clark emphasized society and politics as the driver. Whereas the earlier Marxist critics, like Greenberg and Meyer Shapiro, but also the Frankfurt School, like Siegfried Kracauer, Walter Benjamin, Theodor Adorno, actually they kept those things together. They wouldn't have separated art history from social, economic, political history. They would have seen them as all one thing. And that, in fact, you could tell the story of social history, not just through political history or economic history, but you could actually tell the story of social history via art history or via the history of literature. Right, that art, even when it's rejecting society, is part of society. In fact, in modernism, art participates in society precisely by opposing society. That is, through its oppositional stance, whether implicit or explicit. Remember Trotsky, art is a protest against reality. And Greenberg, avant-garde and kitsch. The artistic avant-garde might have separated itself from the political avant-garde, but was still informed by the problematic condition of society and trying to preserve art by separating itself from society. It was trying to actually preserve the social value of art. Okay, so I mention all of this just because Fried's going to emphasize art historical continuity in terms of modernism, telling the story of modernism. However, that story of continuity with respect to modernism does hit a wall in the 60s. It does hit a particular wall in the 60s. And again, if we just keep in mind Lyotard, contemporary of Fried, just saying, well, maybe it started earlier. Maybe it's more circa World War I, the 20th century avant-garde. Maybe it's already there with Dadaism and Surrealism. I mention that only because the October Art Journal is going to have that perspective. That they're going to be trying to relate their moment, the post-60s moment, to the earlier moment, post-World War I, 20th century avant-garde. That problem tends to drop out of Fried. Fried really emphasizes, like Habermas did, the post-60s character of it. Okay, so he has a epigraph. Let's look at the epigraph. Perry Miller, Jonathan Edwards. Edwards' journals frequently explored and tested a meditation he seldom allowed to reach print. If all the world were annihilated, he wrote, and a new world were freshly created, though it were to exist in every particular in the same manner as this world, it would not be the same. Therefore, because there is continuity, which is time, quote, it is certain with me that the world exists anew every moment, that the existence of things every moment ceases and is every moment renewed. Close quote. The abiding assurance is that quote, "We every moment see the same proof of a God as we should have seen it, as we should have seen if we had seen him create the world at first." Okay, so why does Fried start with this epigraph? So, again, a kind of religious idea, and yet also an artistic idea, meaning that the world is constantly being created anew, art participates in that, and indeed that is God making the world anew in every moment. And again, this is the grace. So the experience of the world that way would be an experience of grace in the world. Okay, here's Fried. The enterprise known variously as minimal art, ABC art, primary structures, and specific objects is largely ideological. It seeks to declare and occupy a position, one that can be formulated in words, and in fact has been formulated by some of its leading practitioners. If this distinguishes it from a modernist painting and sculpture on the one hand, it also marks an important difference between minimal art, or as I prefer to call it, literalist art, and pop or op art on the other. From its inception, literalist art has amounted to something more than an episode in the history of taste. It belongs rather to the history, almost the natural history, of sensibility. And it is not an isolated episode, but the expression of a general and pervasive condition. Its seriousness is vouched for by the fact that it is in relation both to modernist painting and modernist sculpture that literalist art defines or locates the position it aspires to occupy. This, I suggest, is what makes what it declares something that deserves to be called a position. Specifically, literalist art conceives of itself as neither one nor the other. On the contrary, it is motivated by specific reservations, or worse, about both, and it aspires, perhaps not exactly or not immediately, to displace them, but in any case to establish itself as an independent art on a footing with either. So, painting and sculpture, modernist painting, modernist sculpture. Earlier in the course, when we were reading Greenberg, the Newer Laocoon, we revisited this issue also with the photography essays by Krakow and Benini. The difference between an image and a picture. So an image is the physical object, and the picture is what our aesthetic imagination makes of that object. So the idea is what art is, or what an artist's work is to do, is to try to get the viewer to see more than is actually present in the physical object. And that's where this category of picture comes in. So in other words, what kind of a picture does the painting make as a physical image? That would also apply to sculpture. So it applies to both genres of plastic arts. Painting and sculpture both produce an image out of an object. One object which is two-dimensional, of course it's not really two-dimensional, but picture plane is hypothetically two-dimensional, whereas the object is three-dimensional. In either case, the physical object is supposed to cause the viewer to see something that physically is not there. So optical illusion, what is the optical illusion? It's not a sense data perception. It's the work of the imagination. In other words, the fact that we see more than is actually there. This is Kantian aesthetics. The Kantian aesthetics is that we see more than is there, and that also gives the work of art, or the beautiful object, the aesthetic object, the object that's experienced aesthetically as beautiful, gives it the appearance of life that it, of course, doesn't in fact have, because it's an inert thing. It's an object. But gives it a sense of subjectivity. So the painting, or even the work of literature, the poem or the novel, the sculpture, the piece of music, appears to have its own subjectivity, its own life, its own autonomy, and its own freedom. Right, so I think that we've talked earlier in the course about this. Aesthetic autonomy, at least the illusion, the appearance, the phenomenon of the work of art having created itself. That's the coherence of its form, its aesthetic form. The fact that its form, experienced aesthetically, experienced as a function of feeling, its form appears to be autonomous, self-determined. Now, ancient peoples, I'll just, since we have religion and grace in the mix, ancient peoples thought that works of art were not the creation of the artist. And that goes all the way up to the Renaissance. It goes all the way up through the Renaissance. Michelangelo, Raphael. So who did make the work of art? If it's not the artist's creation, then whose creation is it? God's creation? Or the God's creation? Or the divine cosmic forces creation? The artist was just meant to be channeling what is actually the creation of God or the gods. So it's in bourgeois society, it's in modern society, that we recognize that it's the creation of the artist. But not merely the creation of an empirical person. There is capital A art, this metaphysical category. So it's the creation of the artist who's channeling art history, who's channeling societal metaphysics, who is participating in a metaphysical cosmos and channeling the forces of that cosmos into their work. But nonetheless, the artist is an important node in that creative process. Right? So even though it's secularized, it isn't turned into a mere empirical fact thereby. Right. So painting and sculpture, the plastic arts, trying to get you to see more than is there. Literalness might be about not trying to get you to see more than is there, but getting you to see only what's there. And that's why he thinks that these artists have a position. In other words, it's not simply the case that they're not doing painting or sculpture. Rather, they are taking a position with respect to painting and sculpture. And it might be an oppositional or polemical position, but it's a position. Therefore, you can't understand it apart from painting and sculpture as established practices, as established traditions, according to him. And notice he sets it up very neutrally. He's not saying that they're rejecting the tradition. So again, it's not exactly like the avant-garde, like Dada and Surrealism. It's not really about that. I mention all of that because so the Surrealist revolts of Habermas and Lyotard, one critical of it, the other celebratory of it. There is supposed to be a significance beyond the realm of art to the Surrealist revolts, meaning there is a kind of attempt to revolutionize the world by way of art. So it's not meant to be just the culturally specific, kind of narrow, specialized discipline of art that's at issue, but rather our aesthetic experience of the world. And that can take two paradoxical forms. One would be to aestheticize the world. In other words, to try to treat everything around us as if it were a work of art. So, your Dadaism. And so reading a train schedule as if it's a poem. And so aestheticizing reality. Conversely, or dialectically, we could say that it's about the anti-aesthetic. It's about de-aestheticizing the artwork, which also means de-aestheticizing the world. So it has these two opposite directions, two paradoxical directions. One is to aestheticize everything, and the other is to de-aestheticize everything. So to aestheticize everything, starting with the artwork and opening up onto the world, or to de-aestheticize everything, starting with the artwork and opening up onto the world. Okay, the literalist case against painting, Fried writes, rests mainly on two counts: the relational character of almost all painting, and the ubiquitousness, indeed the virtual inescapability of pictorial illusion. In Donald Judd's view, quote, when you start relating parts in the first place, you're assuming you have a vague whole, the rectangle of the canvas, and definite parts, which is all screwed up, because you should have a definite whole and maybe no parts or very few. Right, so you have a vague whole and definite parts, and he's saying no, it should be the opposite, which is that you have a definite whole and maybe no parts or very few. The more the shape of the support is emphasized, so that would be the frame or the pedestal, and we'll see what Krauss does with this. As in recent modernist painting, the tighter the situation becomes, according to Fried. Paraphrasing Judd. Here's Judd again. The elements inside the rectangle are broad and simple and correspond closely to the rectangle. The shapes and surface are only those that can occur plausibly within and on a rectangular plane. The parts are few and so subordinate to unity as not to be parts in an ordinary sense. A painting is nearly an entity, one thing, and not the indefinable sum of a group of entities and references. The one thing overpowers the earlier painting. It also establishes the rectangle as a definite form. It is no longer a fairly neutral limit. A form can be used only in so many ways. The rectangular plane is given a lifespan. The simplicity required to emphasize the rectangle limits the arrangements possible within it. Close quote from Judd. Here's Fried. Painting is here seen as an art on the verge of exhaustion, one in which the range of acceptable solutions to a basic problem, how to organize the surface of the picture, is severely restricted. The use of shaped rather than rectangular supports can, from the literalist point of view, merely prolong the agony. The obvious response is to give up working on a single plane in favor of 3 dimensions. That, moreover, automatically, quote, gets rid of the problem of illusionism and of literal space, space in and around marks and colors, which is riddance of one of the salient and most objectionable relics of European art. The several limits of painting are no longer present. A work can be as powerful as it can be thought to be. Actual space is intrinsically more powerful and specific than paint on a flat surface. Close quote. Now, I'll remind you guys of Greenberg. So Greenberg said that, when we think of the illusion, the pictorial illusion, getting us to see more than is actually there on the physical surface, we're seeing, through the use of line and color, we're seeing lines that are not actually there and colors that are not actually there. We're also seeing space that's not actually there. That's the trompe-l'oeil, the illusion of space. But we're also seeing more color than is actually in the palette, and we're seeing lines that are not actually drawn. Right, so Greenberg put it in terms of a painting that gives a visual space, it provides a visual space that can be traversed by the eye, but not by the body. And we looked at Jackson Pollock. We looked at the lavender mist as an example of that. So there's visual space that can be traversed by the eye, but not by the body. So where does that space exist? If it doesn't exist physically, if the body can't traverse it, where does it exist? It exists in the imagination. It exists in the imagination as suggested by the visual experience, but not literally in the sense data of the optics, of the visual. Right. So Judd is going the other way. Right. He's saying that not that illusory space, that is not even the illusion of physical space, but is only a visual space. Judd is saying actual space is intrinsically more powerful and specific than paint on a surface. Right, so there's an attack on the imagination. What is Fried saying about the rectangle? Well, Judd is saying it's not the neutrality, right, that we might imagine it to be. Fried is saying, well, okay, you just accept a limit, the rectangle form, and then you work within that limit, but it isn't like some kind of inherent limit. It doesn't actually prevent you from doing anything. Right? It gives you a space of play. You can play with that. And it need not be reified in terms of emphasis on the support, emphasis on the frame or on the pedestal. So Fried continues, the literalist attitude towards sculpture is more ambiguous. So he takes a position, Judd, with respect to painting. With respect to sculpture, it's more ambiguous. Judd, for example, seems to think of what he calls specific objects as something other than sculpture, while Robert Morris conceives of his own unmistakably literalist work as resuming the lapsed tradition of constructivist sculpture established by Taitlin, Rodchenko, Gabo, Pevsner, and Van Tongerloo. But this and other disagreements are less important than the views Judd and Morris hold in common. Above all, they are opposed to sculpture that, like most painting, is made part by addition, composed, and in which specific elements separate from the whole, thus setting up relationships within the work. They would include the work of David Smith and Anthony Caro under this description. Now we'll see that Anthony Caro is the sculptor that Fried invokes, or has invoked as a counterpoint to the minimalists. It is worth remarking that the part-by-part and relational character of most sculpture is associated by Judd with what he calls anthropomorphism. A beam thrusts, a piece of iron follows a gesture. Together they form a naturalistic and anthropomorphic image. The space corresponds. Against such a multi-part or inflected sculpture, Judd and Morris assert the values of wholeness, singleness, and indivisibility of a work's being, as nearly as possible, one thing, a single specific object. Now, I raise this because he's already used the term entity, and I think that did we talk about entity previously? We may not have talked about entity. Entity is not the same as identity. It's the first thing that needs to be understood. So entity is just a category of being. It's a category of what is the case. Whereas identity, so something that just exists, the extant. Whereas identity, and specifically in this philosophical language, it's really a matter of self-identity. An entity becomes, it isn't just, but becomes identical with itself. So it becomes identical, becomes self-identical, it retains identity. It realizes what it ought to be. Or it exemplifies its actuality as opposed to its mere existence. So art would be a matter of identity. And what Fried calls objecthood, or the thing, would be a mere category of entity, as opposed to art. So something is a work of art when it becomes identical to itself. How does it become identical to itself? As an aesthetic object. So it's in our aesthetic experience of the object that the artwork becomes identical to itself. So what's interesting to Fried is that Judd and Morris are trying to reverse that, like are very deliberately reversing that. Right? They want to make something that exists as an entity. And they don't like the part-whole relationship in the work of art because they think that the part-whole relationship prevents the artwork from being an entity and makes it depend rather on the aesthetic experience to achieve its self-identity.
Why does the part-whole relationship undermine its entity?
It's a little odd, isn't it? It's a little odd.
Get it.
Yeah, it's a little odd. So let's see what Fried keyed into on the anthropomorphism. So anthropomorphism is, making something human-like. Okay, well, humans. Okay, we are biological creatures. We're entities. We are entities. But our humanness, the humanity of the human being, to recall Foucault's piece on what is enlightenment, right? He said he likes enlightenment rather than humanism, because humanism takes for granted the humanity of the human being, whereas enlightenment is about how the human being becomes human. Right? So anthropomorphism here is not about our biological creatureliness. It's not about our mere existence as iterations of Homo sapiens. It's about attaining our humanity, becoming self-identical as human. Right? So humans are not human by virtue of merely existing, but they become human. How do they become human? Through culture, through society. That's our sacrality. Every culture distinguishes between the mere animal existence of the human and the cultural or social or spiritual existence of our humanity. We're not supposed to act like animals. Every culture enjoins us not to be mere animals. Every culture. Tens of thousands of years. Hundreds of thousands of years. Every culture has insisted that we not act according to our animal nature, but that we be true to our humanity instead. Now, how they've defined that humanity has changed, but nonetheless, that basic thing is there. And by the way, that human revolution, in anthropological terms, is coexistent, coextensive with the invention of language, art, religion. All those things are invented together. They're invented at the same time. Culture. Right, so Judd and Morris are taking aim not just at the bourgeois definition of art, but the entire anthropological history of humanity definition of art. So relating part to whole is about how some things that are physically arranged become something, even if they're not a thing by virtue of their mere physicality. In other words, a painting or a sculpture actually doesn't exist as a physical entity, only exists as an artistic construction. So that's where the part-whole matter comes in. In other words, what's emphasized is that something that isn't a thing becomes something at all. Right? So again, we might lose sight of that in our creaturely existence because we exist by virtue of biological nature. We're not constructed in that way, and artwork is constructed. Nonetheless, that's the affinity to our humanity. The affinity of the artwork to our humanity is precisely in its constructed nature. Even if we're not physical constructs, the way an artwork is, we still are more than the sum of our parts. We're more than our physical being, in the same way that the artwork becomes more than its physical being. It transcends its physical being in the same way that we in our humanity transcend our physical being. Or at least are supposed to. Right? So if we feel that we are not transcending our physical being, I have news for you children. This is like the first time in tens of thousands of years that humans have ever experienced themselves like this. Could it be capitalism that has caused us to feel that we're not more than our physical beings? That we're just wretched animals? That's only happened in the last 200 years. It's only happened relatively recently in the history of humanity that we have felt reduced to our physical selves. So this gives us a little indication of where Fried's animus is coming from. Right? Fried's animus is that maybe these literalist artists are succumbing to the dehumanization of capitalism. They're giving into the dehumanization of capitalism. They're stripping the artwork of its humanity, which means stripping humanity of its humanity. That's the Anthropomorphism. And he's using their own language against them on this. Right? So he's not introducing this. He's taking it from them directly. And again, he wants to know what this is a symptom of. What kind of a symptom is this? Why is this happening now? Why is it happening only starting in the 1960s? Because even when you go back to the Dadaists, they're not doing that. They're actually not doing that. Right? Even Duchamp's urinal or fountain is not doing that. In fact, it's insisting on the anthropomorphism of the artwork. So I'll mention Bell again. So Bell, in Modernism and Capitalism, he says that this degeneration of art and culture has gotten to the point where, and again, we should keep in mind Greenberg's notion of avant-garde and kitsch, that we have a culture of multiples for the elite, and we have porn utopia for the masses. Meaning the masses get unlimited voyeurism. Instead of art, they get unlimited voyeuristic pleasure. And the wealthy, the elite, and the cognoscenti get a culture of multiples. We're going to see what Rosalyn Krauss and Douglas Crypto do with this, because they're going to lean into that. They're going to be like, yes, hell yes, that's what it is. Culture of multiples. We have it emerging already with the industrially produced works of the minimalists, of Judd and Company. Culture of multiples. Which also has an anthropomorphic character, doesn't it? Namely, that we feel ourselves to be mere iterations of multiples. And so we feel robbed of our particular self-identity. Right? Because of course, as mere entities, we are just multiples. Right? We're just copies of Homo sapiens. Right, so how do we become individuals? How do we attain our self-identity as individuals? Through our experience, through our life history, through our experience, through what we make of ourselves, through what we become, through our own participation, our own effort. No, we feel ourselves to be even less than the things that are churned out by mechanical processes of industry. We might identify with the industrially produced object as something better than us. So you guys know about the Donald Judd works, right? So they are industrially made, right? So it's really leaning into, production of works that can only be made industrially. They can't be made artisanally at all. Right, and that's the point. So there are different ways of thinking about that. So one would be, you could understand it as the liberation of aesthetic form as an end in itself. It's almost like a Platonic form. It's sort of form taking on a life of its own. But it's not just that. Right? It's not like the geometrical abstraction of the early 20th century. So you remember that Robert Morris, he quotes him, Fried quotes him saying that he's taking inspiration from the constructivists and others in the early 20th century, Soviet artists. Right, the geometrical abstraction, the suprematism, like Malevich. So this is not really that, right? Because that's, again, the sort of tension between the abstract form and the human-produced artwork, right? That's manifest in the work itself. No, this is a lot more literal, to use Fried's language. I feel like those are the most exemplary, these ones. These are like the most exemplary Judd pieces. I feel like I'm never quite sure that this is actually the same thing. It seems to be something a little bit different. Because the rivets, right, it's got a different quality. This seems more anthropomorphic. This seems like trying to be more than the sum of its parts. So if we go to the part-whole anthropomorphism, the artwork is more than the sum of its parts. Right, so it's not mere aggregate. If you remember, we read the Nietzsche, Use and Abuse of History for Life. How did the Greeks go from being mere human-like aggregates to attaining their own self-identity, even though they're the inheritors of all these different cultural influences, because they sort of combine and transcend. So they kind of, it becomes more than the sum of its parts. All right, and just to recall again the Fried that we read previously, because he introduces this language here, theatricality and absorption. So it's theatricality taken from Diderot, from the enlightened encyclopedist Diderot, and his work on, it's called Rameau's Nephew, about aesthetic education. And really art is about these two things. So using the theater as an example, using dramatic art as an example, stage drama, that of course you never forget that you're seeing a play on stage. You never forget that you're seeing actors play characters. However, you also get absorbed in it, such that you don't only see actors playing parts on a stage. You see more than is actually happening on the stage without ever forgetting that you are in fact seeing actors on a stage. Same thing with the work of art. It's not that you forget you're seeing a painting or you forget you're seeing a sculpture. You don't. And yet you see more. And that's the function of absorption. Right, and so the question is, artists, in Fried's conception, artists as the products of art history, artworks as immanent to art history, that every artwork has to justify its existence, Namely, it has to justify its right to exist. It has to justify its purpose, its point of existing. And it does so in some struggle with theatricality, meaning it struggles against mere conventionalism or mere cultural convention. So it's not just fulfilling the expectations of the viewer or the listener or the reader as to the experience of the artwork, but it's going beyond that conventional definition of the work, which is always medium specific, of course. So that you're never forgetting that you're seeing art, and yet it's more than just quote-unquote art. So what Judd and the others are trying to do here is actually, again, take a position with respect to that and maybe try to sidestep it, which is to say they do seem to be responding to a certain kind of conventionalism of art or a theatricality of art. It's the way they're responding to it that Fried is finding symptomatic. Meaning, instead of transcending the experience of sculpture as merely a cultural convention of sculpture, an institutional convention of sculpture, that they're kind of avoiding that problem by saying it's not sculpture. And that's why he says it's more ambiguous with respect to sculpture than it is with respect to painting. Because, in fact, to attack the two-dimensional, the illusion of the picture plane, that's something that painters had already been doing a lot. You know, that painting had become sculptural, you know, there's cubism, there's all sorts of ways that had already happened. So it is specific to sculpture. Okay, and so what he says about the literalness about the shape, like, shape, the question of shape, physical object, form, so shape is this other thing. The critical factor in shape, Morris's unitary forms are polyhedrons that resist being grasped other than as a single shape. The gestalt simply is the constant known shape. Yeah, let's look at some of that. These dudes. It's so funny that I think when I've done image searches in the past, like the artist portrait never came up. It always, the artworks came up, and now the first thing in both of those was like the portrait of the artist. And I was like, oh my God, I wasn't expecting to see the dudes. I don't need to see the dudes. And shape itself is, in his symptom, quote, the most important sculptural value. Similarly, speaking of his own work, Judd has remarked that the big problem is that anything that is not absolutely plain begins to have parts in some way. The thing is to be able to work and do different things and yet not break up the wholeness that a piece has. To me, the piece with the brass and the 5 verticals is above all that shape. The shape is the object. At any rate, what secures the wholeness of the object is the singleness of the shape. Fried says it is, I believe, this emphasis on shape that accounts for the impression, which numerous critics have mentioned, that Judd's and Morris's pieces are hollow. Hollow. Okay. So what does it mean to say that shape is hollow? Right. Because this is when he really is getting into the question of grace, literalness, and presence. In other words, what kind of a presence is the artwork? So we've talked about this with Benjamin, with the aura. The aura, the strange weave of space and time that is the presence. and that establishes the presence of the object or of the work or of the phenomenon as both near and distant. And so presence as both near and distant. And again, that kind of anthropomorphic aspect of presence, namely that one approaches the artwork as if one were approaching another person, meaning they have a presence in space and time the way people have a presence in space and time. Not so the minimalist sculpture. Not so the minimalist sculpture. Minimalist sculpture doesn't have a presence like a person. It doesn't engage the viewer as a fellow present being. It doesn't have that kind of character of interaction with another subject. So artworks are defined by the illusion. They produce an illusion of an interaction as if between two subjects. So sculpture or painting addresses the viewer as if it were a subject addressing another subject. Instead, what Fried says is that the minimalist sculpture acts as if the viewer is not there. And he phenomenologically explains his experience of these works. He feels bullied by them. He says he feels pushed around by them. He uses language, so he started out with the God stuff, and then he starts using language phenomenologically that more has an erotic quality to it. Namely, that the brute assertion of the minimalist work is like just an entity that's indifferent to everything around it, that doesn't sort of make an appeal or address the viewer, but kind of more brutally kind of positions the viewer. Or as he puts it, pushes the viewer around. Right, so it doesn't allow for the viewer to engage it on a more equal footing between like two subjects, allowing for that interaction, interplay of subject and object, but instead seems to demand submission to its physical presence. Now again, that's not just to make like a moral judgment against Judd and Morris, right? So it's not to sort of condemn their work, but also we have to ask the question, what's that a symptom of? Why would artists try to make works that function this way, that have this character of experience to them? So do you guys know brutalist architecture? Brutalist architecture. And then, of course, there's the film, which is kind of not a great film. The Brutalist? I don't know. I wasn't entirely hot. Do you know this film about the architect? No? You got to see all the Oscar-worthy films, children. You got to keep up with the high-class trash.
People say that, like, from like an architectural historical point, there's a lot of questionable things.
Oh, no doubt. No doubt. I mean, in other words, it's very much, it's tendentious. Like, it's definitely... Like the film is definitely trying to like make a point that may or may not be true to like the characters or even the phenomenon, you know. But anyway, why do we call this stuff brutalism? Right? Because it's architecture that seems to assert a physical presence that completely, at least subordinates, potentially even negates a human presence and interaction. All right, so it's not even like, you know, older architecture was meant to inspire like awe and power and like sublimity, but that's still addressing the viewer. That's still addressing the subject. Brutalist architecture, it just asserts its existence regardless of whether any humans are there at all. right? So there's something more broadly symptomatic going on. And I mention that only because the term postmodernism is from architecture, and it's from post-World War II architecture in particular. I think that's where the term was introduced. And it has its antecedents in international style architecture, like the, and also the sort of Bauhaus aesthetic, right? So the funny thing about Judd, you know, when we're looking at these Judd pieces, it's kind of like, aren't we surrounded by all this already? Like this kind of thing? Isn't it just like pretty much everything? Right, we have it from the Bauhaus aesthetic. And what Benjamin said about the Bauhaus aesthetic. He's very critical of it. Right, that it, the new matter-of-factness, the neue Sachlichkeit, or the new objectivity, that was another way of translating it, new objectivity, again, objecthood as opposed to art, functionalism, that apart from its, you know, kind of socially egalitarian, kind of economic, distributive, like cheap stuff, like, you know, quality things for the masses that they can afford, but it also has this other quality. It has a aesthetic quality that is peculiar and that it shares with photography, which is the self-evidence of everything that exists. And the aestheticization of mere existence. So Benjamin put it as, life is beautiful. Like, it just is beautiful, even to the point where you can photograph things that are about the experience of suffering, and by photographing it, you make it beautiful. You make it beautiful by asserting its mere existence. But not only poverty, but the struggle against poverty can be turned into an object of beauty, can be aestheticized by photography. And there's something about this Bauhaus aesthetic that has taken over, that everyone finds acceptable, like this is like neutral, like it's not really making a statement. It is making a statement. It's just making a statement that we all agree to. And how do we notice that? How do we kind of denaturalize or defamiliarize this? How can we question what is unquestionable about contemporary capitalism? So Fried introduces the idea that this has to do with the experience not of the beautiful, but of the sublime. And the sublime, we talked about this earlier in the semester, whereas the beautiful is about seeing in an object a kind of spontaneous freedom and autonomy that reminds us of ourselves. There's a sympathetic resonance of subject and object, whereas the sublime is about something that is on the threshold of being terrifying, but that we don't get terrified by, that we're not overwhelmed by. And so it's the pleasure of something that causes us pain in its incomprehensibility, but then when we experience it as sublime, we make the incomprehensible comprehensible. We make the potentially overwhelming not overwhelming of our senses. So it's about the pleasure that we experience of the force of our own subjectivity to be able to master, if only in our feelings and if only in our imagination, something that actually is overwhelming. And Baudelaire leaned into this and indeed went beyond the sublime into the terrifying. That what was beautiful was terrifying. What was beautiful was what was overwhelming, incomprehensible, inhuman, in fact. Right, so the example that Fried invokes is the experience of an unfinished highway. Is it Morris? I think it's Morris who takes his students out to the highway in order to see the cityscape from the standpoint of the unfinished highway, and says, this should be the model. Right, so again, the overwhelming scale. Hold on. Oh, it might be Smith. Hold on. I forgot who it is. Oh, yeah, here we go. It's Tony Smith. Right. Tony Smith's description of a car ride taken at night on the New Jersey Turnpike before it was finished makes compelling reading. When I was teaching at Cooper Union in the first year or two of the 50s, someone told me how I could get onto the unfinished New Jersey Turnpike. I took 3 students and drove from somewhere in the meadows to New Brunswick. It was a dark night, and there were no lights or shoulder markers, lines, railings, or anything at all except the dark pavement moving through the landscape of the flats, rimmed by hills in the distance, but punctuated by stacks, towers, fumes, and colored lights. This drive was a revealing experience. The road and much of the landscape was artificial, and yet it couldn't be called a work of art. On the other hand, it did something for me that art had never done. At first, I didn't know what it was, but its effect was to liberate me from many of the views I had had about art. It seemed that there had been a reality that had not had any expression in art. The experience on the road was something mapped out but not socially recognized. I thought to myself, it ought to be clear that's the end of art. Most painting looks pretty pictorial after that. There is no way you can frame it, you just have to experience it. Later, I discovered some abandoned airstrips in Europe, abandoned works, surrealist landscapes, something that had nothing to do with any function, created worlds without tradition. Artificial landscape without cultural precedent began to dawn on me. There is a drill ground in Nuremberg large enough to accommodate 2 million men. The entire field is enclosed with high embankments and towers. The concrete approach is 3 16-inch steps, one above the other stretching for a mile or two. Then Fried writes, what seems to have been revealed to Smith that night was the pictorial nature of painting, even, one might say, the conventional nature of art. And this Smith seems to have understood not as laying bare the essence of art, but as announcing its end. In comparison with the unmarked, unlit, all but unstructured turnpike, more precisely with the turnpike as experienced from within the car traveling on it, art appears to have struck Smith as almost absurdly small. All art today is an art of postage stamps, he has said. Circumscribed and conventional. There was, he seems to have felt, no way to frame his experience on the road, that is, no way to make sense of it in terms of art, to make art of it, at least as art then was. Rather, you just have to experience it as it happens, as it merely is. The experience alone is what matters. There is no suggestion that this is problematic in any way. The experience is clearly regarded by Smith as wholly accessible to everyone, not just in principle, but in fact, and the question of whether or not one has really had it does not arise. That this appeals to Smith can be seen from his praise of Le Corbusier as more available than Michelangelo. So remember that Le Corbusier was mentioned by Benjamin in Experience and Poverty, alongside Adolphe Loos. Quote, the direct and primitive experience of the High Court building at Chandigarh is like the pueblos of the Southwest under a fantastic overhanging cliff. It's something everyone can understand, close quote. It is, Fried continues, I think, hardly necessary to add that the availability of modernist art is not of this kind, and that the rightness or relevance of one's conviction about specific modernist works, a conviction that begins and ends in one's experience of the work itself, is always open to question. Conviction, I forgot to mention this. So he has absorption and theatricality, and then he has conviction. And that's just to be understood as convincing, meaning does an artwork convince you of itself in your experience of it? Okay, here's Fried again. But what was Smith's experience on the turnpike? Or to put the same question another way, if the turnpike, airstrips, and drill ground are not works of art, what are they? What indeed, if not empty or abandoned, situations? And what was Smith's experience, if not the experience of what I've been calling theater? It is as though the turnpike, airstrips, and drill ground reveals the theatrical character of literalist art, only without the object, that is, without the art itself, as though the object is needed only within a room, or perhaps in any circumstance less extreme than these. In each of the above cases, the object is, so to speak, replaced by something. For example, on the turnpike, by the constant onrush of the road, the simultaneous recession of new reaches of dark pavement illumined by the onrushing headlights. The sense of the turnpike itself as something enormous, abandoned, derelict, existing for Smith alone and for those in the car with him. This last point is important. On the one hand, the turnpike, airstrips, and drill ground belong to no one. On the other, the situation established by Smith's presence is in each case felt by him to be his. Moreover, in each case, being able to go on and on indefinitely is of the essence. What replaces the object? What does the same job of distancing or isolating the beholder, of making him a subject, that the object did in the closed room, is above all the endlessness or objectlessness of the approach or onrush of perspective. It is the explicitness, that is to say, the sheer persistence with which the experience presents itself as directed at him from outside. On the turnpike from outside the car, that simultaneously makes him a subject, makes him subject, and establishes the experience itself as something like that of an object, or rather of objecthood. No wonder Morris's speculations about how to put literalist works outdoors remain strangely inconclusive. Quote, why not put the work outdoors and further change the terms? A real need exists to allow this next step to become practical. We'll see how Rosalyn Krauss addresses this. Architecturally designed sculpture courts are not the answer, nor is the placement of work outside cubic architectural forms. Ideally, it is a space without architecture as background and reference that would give different terms to work with. Again, this is what Krauss is going to pursue. Unless the pieces are set down in a wholly natural context, and Morris does not seem to be advocating this, some sort of artificial but not quite architectural setting must be constructed. What Smith's remarks seem to suggest is that the more effective, meaning art, effective as theater, the setting is made, the more superfluous the works themselves become. Okay. Right, so theatricality and absorption, conviction of the beholder, and the beholder is not just another object among other objects. Right, the way Smith and his students experience themselves on the car, on the turnpike. The other thing that occurs to me is the way artists experienced archaeological ruins. I don't know if it's let me see. I'm going to forget who it is. No, it's not Georgia O'Keeffe. Maybe, okay, Georgia O'Keeffe is one, but that's an earlier generation. It's a post-war artist, and I'm forgetting who it is now, which one of them it is. I don't know if it's one of the color field painters. Wrote about his experience of Machu Picchu, but again, I'm forgetting who it is. It's not, it might be Rothko, it might just be Rothko, but I feel like it's not Rothko, it's one of the other ones. And the way they describe Machu Picchu, do you guys know what Machu Picchu is? That's the site in Peru. It's the religious site, the abandoned religious site with strange forms in it. Let's see if they give us any details. Quasi, not exactly. Oh, kind of, not really. Oh, maybe, okay. good example. Right, that what they found interesting about Machu Picchu was that it just existed, right? That it existed like without any reference to the visitor, right? That it has this kind of monumental character, but outside of any relatable ritual, because precisely no one knows, including the Incas, at the time of the colonial contact. No one knew what it was for anymore. So this abandoned city ritual structures that no one knew what the ritual was anymore. And so the structures just became pure form. Right, so that's part of what Fried is likening to the experience of the turnpike. Right, that even contemporary reality can have this character. Longyu?
Yeah, I think my main question, you heavily tackled it in the lecture, is I was asking, like, how do you tell a minimalist sculpture object from like a regular object? And you say it's actually it's the sublime. And I was like, oh my god, I didn't realize that it's the sublime. And I have another question. So on page 136, Fried kind of said that they, like, the minimalists were kind of seeing that in the modernist paintings, and they argue that it's the modernist painting is moving towards a kind of objecthood. But like, I was wondering, like, why did they say that?
Well, okay, so there's a kind of paradoxical character to, again, Fried as a student of Greenberg. If the flatness of the picture plane is being emphasized, according to Greenberg, that it's not simply any kind of abstraction, but what all the different abstraction efforts in painting had in common was the medium specificity of painting, emphasizing the picture plane as the sort of 0 degree condition, we might say, of painting. But again, what one does with that. In other words, one could struggle in and against that, or one could just sort of accede to it, or submit to it. So they are experiencing the same thing but differently. So it's the same phenomenon, the same historical trajectory, but responding to it differently than painters had previously. All right, so let's see what he says here. The starkness and apparent irreconcilability of this conflict is something new. So the conflict is between the theatrical and the pictorial. So this is something new, he thinks, because before the conflict was more generative, now it seems to be a kind of flat opposition. And then Fried says, I remarked earlier that objecthood has become an issue for modernist painting only within the past several years. This, however, is not to say that before the present situation came into being, paintings or sculptures, for that matter, simply were objects. It would not, I think, be closer to the truth. It would, I think, be closer to the truth to say that they simply were not. In other words, that even though they did assert their objecthood, they didn't remain at that status. And he goes on that this possibility began to present itself around 1960, was largely the result of developments within modernist painting. Roughly, the more nearly assimilable to objects certain advanced painting had come to seem, the more the entire history of painting since Manet could be understood, he says delusively, I believe, as consisting in the progressive, although ultimately inadequate, revelation of its essential objecthood. And the more urgent became the need for modernist painting to make explicit its conventional, specifically its pictorial, essence by defeating or suspending its own objecthood through the medium of shape. The view of modernist painting as tending towards objecthood is implicit in Judd's remark. Quote, the new, i.e. literalist work, obviously resembles sculpture more than it does painting, but it is nearer to painting. Close quote. And it is in this view, Fried continues, that literalist sensibility in general is grounded. Literalist sensibility is therefore a response to the same developments that have largely compelled modernist painting to undo its objecthood. More precisely, the same developments seen differently, that is, seen in theatrical terms, by a sensibility already theatrical, already, to say the worst, corrupted or perverted by the theater. Similarly, what has compelled modernist painting to defeat or suspend its own objecthood is not just developments internal to itself, but the same general enveloping infectious theatricality that corrupted literalist sensibility in the first place, in the grip of which the developments in question, and modernist painting in general, are seen as nothing more than an uncompelling and presenceless kind of theater. It was the need to break the fingers of this grip that made objecthood an issue for modernist painting. Okay, so let's unpack that a little bit. All right, so I will just point out that he mentions Manet here. Later, his writings on Manet, and I think he mentions this in his response to T.J. Clark that we read. He thinks that Manet defeats theatricality by leaning into theatricality. So it's, that you could defeat theatricality by emphasizing it. And we looked at the example of Titian's Venus of Urbino and Manet's Olympia and how we take that. In other words, do we experience it just as a kind of postmodernist pastiche or kind of a send-up of the Titian? We might, but Manet didn't mean it that way. In other words, Manet certainly did not mean to do a send-up of the Titian. He rather wanted to reproduce the effect of the Titian, but with a conviction that the Titian itself lacked, because the Titian had merely become kind of historical, canonized, conventional, theatrical in that sense. So to make a convincing experience of painting, of doing the Titian painting, actually required doing it differently. And Fried thought that the way Manet defeated the theatricality of painting, not only in that work but in other works, was to actually emphasize the theatricality of painting. All right, so that's a little bit different from just treating the theatrical as the corrupting or perverting influence. The language he uses here. All right, so he must mean something else. Again, it's the theatrical not in the artwork, but the theatrical in general. So Manet's painting about painting is about defeating the theatricality of painting by emphasizing the theatricality of painting, whereas with the literalist artists, according to Fried, what's happening is that the theatricality of art is being submerged within the general theatricality of life. Right, that's why it seems to be, to Fried's mind, avoiding the task of art. Meaning jumping from the experience of the artwork to the experience of things in general. Longy, what else do you have?
I think for me that's basically in
Okay. Let's take a break then, and then we'll come back and do the Krauss. All right, let's resume. I thought I saw Gabe coming back. Ay, ay, ay. All right, let's transition to the Rosalyn Krauss, but let's end with the last bit of Fried. He says, this essay will be read as an attack on certain artists and critics and as a defense of others. And of course, it is true that the desire to distinguish between what is to me authentic art of our time and other work, which, whatever the dedication, passion, and intelligence of its creators, seems to me to share certain characteristics associated here with the concepts of literalism in theater, has largely motivated what I have written. In these last sentences, however, I want to call attention to the utter pervasiveness, the virtual universality of the sensibility or mode of being that I have characterized as corrupted or perverted by theater. We're all literalists, most of or all of our lives. Presentness is grace. Now, that issue of presentness, again, I want to recall from Walter Benjamin's work of art in the Age of Mechanical Reproduction. Distraction, the category of distraction from Benjamin's work of art essay, and that it's not distraction from the work, it's distraction from ourselves. Right, so presentness also means being present with oneself. Right, so absorption in the Freudian sense is that we're absorbed not in the object, but in our experience of the object. And we're absorbed in it in the sense that we are present with it, or it has a presentness. So it's not what Benjamin described about film, because film would be an archetypal kind of literalist medium and theatrical medium in Fried's sense, where we are absorbed in the experience but unreflective about it and not able to be present with ourselves as subjects in that experience. All right, so in the interest of time, let's turn to the sculpture in the expanded field piece. Okay, so I mentioned earlier in class that Krauss is responding to Michael Fried. And she's doing her best to take up the things that Fried finds problematical as what is of interest to her. So we talked about it in terms of art versus cultural categories, or categories of cultural practice. All right, so she treats art as a cultural category, and she does so in a very specific way, namely in terms of structuralism. So she's taking up structuralism, and by structuralism, structural anthropology and structural linguistics. So in terms of structural anthropology, the idea is that culture is defined by binaries. So in the first part of class, we mentioned the sacred-profane binary. That's one. Another would be male-female. And that these binaries are structured according to a principle of distinction from the other side of the binary. In other words, male is defined by not female, female is defined by not male. Sacred is defined by not profane, profane is defined by not sacred. So what she sets up is how sculpture as an art is defined by not being landscape and not being architecture. So sculpture is not landscape and not architecture. It's defined by its distinction from. And she calls it not a positivity, but a negativity, a combination of exclusions. Right, so there's a way of thinking about the not. There are two different ways of thinking about the not. One is that it is more than landscape and more than architecture. And the other, which she thinks it's fallen into, so originally it was that it transcended landscape and transcended architecture. But now it's more exclusive of. In other words, that it's defined by excluding landscape and architecture. Now there's another term, again a kind of anthropological term in terms of cultural practice, and that's monument. So sculpture is not landscape, not architecture, but it's also not monument. Meaning sculpture as art. So sculpture as a cultural practice begins as monument, and monument as distinct from landscape and architecture. So landscape is what we'd call the built environment, and I think that we've talked about this previously in the course. The three major genres of easel painting are portrait, still life, and landscape. And that with landscape, it's not just the depiction of raw nature, but it's the depiction of nature as shaped by human activity. So it's literally the scape of the land that's being depicted. And then in the more recent era, starting already to a certain degree in painting in the late 19th century, but especially in 20th century photography, that the photography of raw nature, or the painting of raw nature itself, becomes landscape. And it's because it's the painting that makes it shaped by the human, as opposed to the land as shaped by human activity. All right, so it begins a little bit with Romanticism, it emerges more in Modernism, but really it's a 20th century phenomenon. Like Ansel Adams, like the kind of, if you know that school of photography. Right. Okay, so I mentioned this just because landscape is the built environment. It's not like just nature by any means. It's the built environment. So we could say that actually the first thing that humans do is landscape. Namely, they modify nature. And they do so both practically, but also ritualistically. They do so for religious reasons. And then architecture transcends landscape. You know, so architecture is not just shaping the land for practical or ritualistic reasons, but it's the built structures, both for practical and ritualistic reasons. Now, monument, now you could say that actually landscape was a form of monument, and architecture was a form of monument insofar as they were ritual in character. But then monuments themselves are also not landscape, not architecture, in the sense that they go beyond landscape and architecture. And you could say that the monument has a purely ritual function as opposed to landscape and architecture, which can either have a practical or a ritual function. Sculpture takes that purely ritual function of monument and turns it into art. Now, again, in an anthropological sense, you could say these ritual things were themselves art, like landscape was art or architecture was art, monument was art. But because they're so tied to either practical or ritual purposes, they're not art in the way that sculpture is art, because sculpture is art in the sense that it might transcend a practical or ritual function, and specifically transcend monument in its ritual function. So one of the things that she's trying to do with respect to Fried is turn what Fried is considering to be like a collapse of art, collapse of painting and sculpture, into something more productive, generative. So he thinks that it's a kind of collapse of art into objecthood, a collapse of art into theatricality. She's saying, well, no, maybe it's not that. Maybe it's not a kind of failure or an absence of art, but moving in another direction. That's the expanded field idea. And the way she talks about the sort of positive and negative aspects of the knot, she talks about it in terms of the complex and the neuter, meaning the positive knot or positive negation is complexifying as opposed to neuter, which means sort of neutralizing. Okay, so she opens up that original schema of sculpture being non-landscape and not architecture, and she tries to unfold it further from that relation. But it unfolds in various directions, meaning it unfolds in the direction of landscape, it unfolds in the direction of architecture, but it also unfolds in terms of the relationship between landscape and architecture. And because it does that, it creates new potential coordinate points, and that's where these question marks are. And that's where she's situating the phenomena that she's considering, so the practices that she's seeing in her contemporary world. Can't be understood within this framework, but might be able to be understood in this expanded field of the relations of these categories. Now, I mentioned that sculpture is not just not landscape and not architecture, and she acknowledges that it's meant to be more than landscape and more than architecture, and also more than monument. But that's what she's trying to capture here. In other words, something that is more than the landscape, not landscape binary, something that's more than the architecture, not architecture binary, and something more than the landscape architecture distinction. So again, she wants to see these as potentially new cultural practices rather than new forms of sculpture. So she doesn't see it as new forms of art in terms of sculpture, but what she calls new cultural practices. But what's interesting is that they're cultural practices that don't have a ready practical or ritual function. Right, that's why they can't be understood as just landscape or architecture. So they're not landscape and they're not architecture, but they're also not sculpture. And that doesn't mean simply the collapse of art into this abyss, the way Michael Fried treated it. Again, she wants to treat it more positively or productively or generatively. So here's a question that I want to put to you guys. So it opened up, evidently, according to Rosalyn Krauss, the practices opened up with respect to the earthworks and other similar phenomena sharing this moment. Have we done anything beyond that since then? So we had this opening up of sculpture into other practices. Seemingly, in her account, that happened in the 60s and 70s. But did we go beyond that since then? Or have we crawled back into culture, into sculpture, I should say. Back into sculpture in some way. So basically, in the post-war period, you had installation, you had earthworks, you had these sort of, crypto monuments. But where have we gone since then? Because her point here is that this could open up infinitely. Right, that these practices could then generate other possibilities.
Are you asking, have we gone past that infinity?
Or no, you've just gone beyond that stage. Like just this opening stage right here. Like have we opened the origami folding further than this since then? Or have we not?
We should put social practice in there.
That's what I was just thinking of, in fact. Actually, as I asked the question for the second time, I thought, oh, yeah, that's right. How would relational aesthetics fit into it? If you recall from the Fried, he said that what the specific objects or the literal works do is create situations. Now, it's ironic because, of course, the Surrealists had that idea, and the Situationists followed from the Surrealists with that idea. And it would seem that relational aesthetics or social practice art is following in that tradition, is following in that kind of path, perhaps, right? I don't know if that fits into this or not. That's a good question, right? That's a good question, but maybe you could say more about that, how you were thinking of it.
Well, I just don't know how you go past infinite open. Expanded field is like we were talking about this yesterday in the sculpture dialogues. It's like, is that a problem? Sculpture can be anything.
Well, because it's about the sculptural. So anything can be sculpture as long as it's related to the sculptural, or no?
This expanded field is like, because it's infinite, people see it as a problem. Yeah.
Well, okay, so she's not setting it up as infinite. In other words, these are determinate at this stage, right? But it's potentially infinite in terms of further development.
So maybe we have gone beyond
Perhaps. I mean, the issue is, so this is like what we would call like as 3D art, right? Which may be concept art and social practices or relational aesthetics may not be 3D, right? I mean, we're going to see what Krauss does with painting and photography, the 2D. But the 3D, if we keep it in that realm, like what do landscape architecture and sculpture have in common? 3D. Right, so it could be that social practices and relational aesthetics is not part of this problem, but something else. I'm not sure. So you're in architecture?
No, I'm in sculpture.
You're in, excuse me, not art, sculpture, yes. That was a Freudian slip. I meant to say sculpture and it came out architecture because I'm in her Lacanian, structuralist negation headspace. Okay, so you're in sculpture. Is relational aesthetics understood in terms of sculpture or no?
I mean, my experience so far is that we can do whatever we want in sculpture. So yes, but I don't really know, honestly. I don't feel like I understand the full extent of the expanded field, but that's what actually is called sculpture. In many sculpture departments are called sculpture in the expanded field.
Yeah, you can blame her for this.
Yeah.
Absolutely, you can blame her for this. Total. Yeah. The question is it an expanded field or not? Right, that's the question. Meaning, in terms of what she's intending to do, has it happened, or did those? kind of terminate, you know. And then, like I said, we've kind of crawled our way back to sculpture. I mean, I understand that in the SAIC, like in departments, you can do whatever you want in any department, pretty much. Maybe some departments are more disciplinarily conservative than others. Like maybe painting is a little bit more. But I feel like that's also not necessarily a permanent thing. Like I feel like that's been like a long phase of the painting department.
I do feel like some of the professors in sculpture they will say that's not sculpture.
Yes.
Yeah.
Well, or at least if that's a question, right? Meaning whether or not it is a question. And then the issue is how does the work tackle that question? So it's a little bit different from the Fried question. So the Fried question is how are people like slipping out of art history? Like I said, he's got a frankly conservative viewpoint, and we're all supposed to like basically reject Fried. Like I think that's the idea. I don't think anybody says Fried was right. Let's follow Fried's point. Like nobody does that. I might say, you know, we should not forget the point of Fried, but that doesn't mean you can really follow Fried. Now, whereas people have tried to follow Krauss, for sure. Right, they've taken it up more programmatically. Yeah, so what did you guys make of this discussion in the Krauss? Long you have some notes.
I don't know. I'm not sure if I understand the process because I'm like really confused by the formal logic part.
Yes.
I don't.
How so?
I just don't know why suddenly there's like more terms.
It is peculiar. I don't know if it corresponds to formal logic or not. Like I said, it's structuralism, which, traditional formal logic, it probably does not fit that, right? So the way the not landscape, not architecture is being used is peculiar. It's peculiar. Like I said, it has more to do with structural anthropology and structural linguistics. And then there is a little Lacanianism there too. Like she's got some Lacanianism running around there as well, which is again, there's this idea that there's a structure of psychology, structure of cognition, and especially a structure of psychology and cognition according to these linguistic categories or cultural categories. But beyond the confusion of that, what else did you make of it? I mean, presumably, right, okay, so we've been talking about aesthetic experience a great deal. And that is not really what's going on here. I mean, even though she starts the essay with a phenomenological description, toward the center of the field there is a slight mound, a swelling in the earth, which is the only warning given for the presence of the work. Closer to it, the large square face of the pit can be seen, as can the ends of the ladder that is needed to descend into the excavation. The work itself is thus entirely below grade, half atrium, half tunnel, the boundary between outside and in, a delicate structure of wooden posts and beams. The work, Perimeters, Pavilions, Decoys, 1978, by Mary Ness, is, of course, a sculpture, or more precisely, an earthwork. So what she does is, she basically gives us this kind of mysterious phenomenon, and where it's unclear what it is, if it's anything at all, what it is, and then she resolves it with a kind of an anticlimax, a sculpture, or more precisely, an earthwork. Now I say that only because, okay, maybe we would come across this thing and we'd be like, what the hell is this? Is this some kind of excavation? Is it some kind of like building foundation in process or something? And then it's like, oh no, it's art, right? So again, art, the theatricality, the conventionality. So she does this kind of, or of course it's a sculpture, or more precisely, an earthwork. And then she says, over the last 10 years, rather surprising things have come to be called sculpture. Narrow corridors with TV monitors on the ends, large photographs documenting country hikes, mirrors placed at strange angles in ordinary rooms, temporary lines cut into the floor of the desert. So it's like the Nazca lines. Nothing, it would seem, could possibly give to such a motley of effort the right to lay claim to whatever one might mean by the category of sculpture, unless, that is, the category can be made to become almost infinitely malleable. The critical operations that have accompanied post-war American art, so again, after World War II, have largely worked in the service of this manipulation. So the manipulation is the category can be infinitely malleable. In the hands of this criticism, categories like sculpture and painting have been kneaded and stretched and twisted in an extraordinary demonstration of elasticity, a display of the way a cultural term can be extended to include just about anything. And though this pulling and stretching of a term such as sculpture is overtly performed in the name of Vanguard aesthetics, or the Avant-garde, the ideology of the new, its covert message is that of historicism. So what does she mean by historicism? She means assimilating things into the history of art. The new is made comfortable by being made familiar, since it is seen as having gradually evolved from the forms of the past. Historicism works on the new and different to diminish newness and mitigate difference. It makes a place for change in our experience by evoking the model of evolution, so that the man who now is can be accepted as being different from the child he once was, by simultaneously being seen through the unseeable action of the telos as the same. And we are comforted by this perception of sameness, the strategy for reducing anything foreign in either space or time to what we already know and are. Right, so it's the collapsing of becoming into being. And that's the Mary Miss sculpture that she was describing. The outside and the inside of it. No sooner had minimal sculpture appeared on the horizon of the aesthetic experience of the 1960s than criticism began to construct a paternity for this work, a set of constructivist fathers who could legitimize and therefore authenticate the strangeness of these objects. Plastic, inert geometries, factory production. None of this was really strange, as the ghosts of Gabo and Tatlin and Lisitsky could be called in to testify. Never mind that the content of the one had nothing to do with, was in fact the exact opposite of, the content of the other. Never mind that Gabo's celluloid was the sign of lucidity and intellection, while Judd's plastic tinged with Dayglow spoke the hip patois of California. It did not matter that constructivist forms were intended as visual proof of the immutable logic and coherence of universal geometries, while their seeming counterparts in minimalism were demonstrably contingent, denoting a universe held together not by mind or Geist, spirit, but by guy wires or glue or the accidents of gravity. The rage to historicize simply swept these differences aside. Of course, with the passing of time, these sweeping operations got a little harder to perform. As the 60s began to lengthen into the 70s and sculpture began to be piles of thread waste on the floor, or sawed redwood timbers rolled into the gallery, or tons of earth excavated from the desert, or stockades of logs surrounded by fire pits, the word sculpture became harder to pronounce, but not really that much harder. The historian critic simply performed a more extended sleight of hand and began to construct his genealogies out of the data of millennia rather than decades. Stonehenge, the Nazca Lines, the Toltec ball courts, Indian burial mounds, anything at all could be hauled into court to bear witness to this work's connection to history and thereby to legitimize its status as sculpture. Of course, Stonehenge and the Toltec ball courts were just exactly not sculpture, and so their role as historicist precedent becomes somewhat suspect in this particular demonstration. But never mind, the trick can still be done by calling upon a variety of primitivizing work from the earlier part of the century. Brancusi's endless column will do to mediate between extreme past and present. Okay, so that's where she wants to get out of the question of whether and how these things are sculpture. And how she's doing it. So she's trying to address the same problems that we were dealing with earlier in the course with respect to the dialectic of transformation, being and becoming, nature and spirit, history in this sense. But she's doing it with this structuralism approach. Right? That's where sculpture becomes a cultural category rather than an art historical category. Right, so to escape its pacification or homogenization as an art historical category, she broadens it into a cultural category. She doesn't actually have the endless column. Let's see if I can find that. Right, so she makes a big deal of this, namely the sculpture absorbing the support. So here it's just the support kind of piled up. Right, so it's kind of like, what is the sculpture? Well, the sculpture is the support, but just endlessly accumulated. And then, it could go on forever, but then it sort of stops, it's sort of fractured or fragmented. And then, is that like waiting for the sculpture? So here would be maybe the opposite example, the beginning of the world. Meaning, what is the sculpture here? On the one hand, it would seem to be this, and yet it's sort of inseparable from the support. Meaning this, the base seems to have the character of having created this thing. And then it's a little bit like the bean. What is it called? Cloudgate? Is it Cloudgate? Cloudgate. I always think that it's got a dystopian name, the bean, because it's like, it reminds me of the Heaven's Gate, the cult that committed mass suicide, right? that's like Cloudgate, I'm like, oh, so what? Like some cult is going to go there and commit mass suicide, like staring into the reflection, waiting for the end of the world. So, you know, so the fact that it's like the being, that it's like the percept of perception, you know, it's like the mirror that's taking in the whole world, you know, that it's like the subject that rests on its condition of possibility, you know, the structure, you know, and that it's raising it. I don't know if this is eye level or not. I don't think that it's quite eye level. But again, Fried would say that what makes this an artwork is that we regard it as another subject. Right. Whereas the works that Krauss is calling attention to defy that. We would have some difficulty relating to it that way. Like the Richard Serra, Miss Mary Miss, or these Robert Morris. Let's see. Now, what makes this not architecture, by the way? Isn't it architecture? Isn't that architecture? But no, it's not architecture. So, why is it not architecture? Because it's art.
I think yell at you sound.
Well, there's that. Yeah, there's that, exactly, right? So it doesn't have a practical or ritual function.
It's more aesthetic than it is practical.
It's aesthetic, right? So it's still art. Of course. But it's the aesthetic sort of connected directly to the practical or the ritual. Right? It's not the aesthetic for its own sake. Whereas this is the aesthetic for its own sake.
But are there not parts of architecture that don't have some certain types of architecture? They are attached to it, but so is that.
Uh-huh. You mean ornamentation.
Yeah.
So we encountered the Adolf Loos and Walter Gropius. Ornament as crime, or ornament and crime. Is it ornament and crime? It's ornament and crime. And it's like ornamentation is so objectionable that it's crime. Like it's like a moral offense. Against what though? Against architecture. Right? So, which is very peculiar. Right? So again, the Frankfurt School would have us understand that that happens at that moment in history for a reason. Meaning capitalism is sort of motivating this kind of a polemical or extreme kind of discontent with respect to this. Because what's wrong with ornamentation? Is there anything wrong with ornamentation?
I think architecture always goes back to like the whole like form versus function thing. It goes back to like kind of idea in architecture, which is like what was our kind of.
Mm-hmm.
I haven't read a whole lot about it, but it's based on the last year where it's like, in a way, I can see that as being part of the argument, whereas so much of architecture, at least like tradition, is based on the idea of like the town, post-it town.
Yeah, explain the hut, why it goes back to the hut. So the hut.
It's just because, like, it's like the crime and ornament. At least I think that was the writing, where he goes on this whole, like, tangent about, like, carpets and tattoos. It's like stripping away the aesthetic for the sake of function, and like architecture's first function in some people's minds was to form shelter. And in a way, it's like I could see that argument being made towards excluding ornaments or excluding like aesthetics from architecture, because that's what its like foundational purpose was.
But it's reified, isn't it? In other words, it's sort of experienced that way, and it's very peculiar. So we talked about the Apaches, we talked about Baudelaire, the Paris of the Second Empire, and Baudelaire, and the Apaches, and the dandy, based on the Native American warrior. And now the body painting of the Native American warrior is not like aesthetic. It's like part of the warfare. You know, it's not camouflage either. It's like dazzle. Like, so it's meant to like. It's meant to make it harder for your opponent to fight you, or it's meant to distract and to kind of visually overwhelm. Whereas, of course, Baudelaire does two things with that, right? He says it is aesthetic, like it is the person turning themselves into a work of art, but also art itself is combat.
Well, and I think it is loosely covered. I think it's not necessary. But it's very, I mean, it's kind of like.
There's no such thing as a purely functional object until, like, basically Bauhaus. Because it always had an aesthetic, and it was always sort of part of its functionality was its aesthetics, right? So it wasn't like the subordination of the aesthetic to the functional. That wouldn't have made sense to people at all until like the 20th century. And so that's just something to consider, right? And, you know, so this is still, like, the Robert Morris is still aesthetic. You know, the green room installation is still aesthetic. And it seems to be, in fact, not only is it aesthetic, but it's, like, kind of purely aesthetic in a way that architecture that has an aesthetic dimension is not purely aesthetic. All right, so I say all of this, I'm a little bit, you might detect a little bit skeptical of Krauss. You know, in other words, what happens when you expand art into culture? Aren't you just still left with art? Isn't it still art? And then the question is, well, what is art? What is this aesthetic experience of art? You know, so again, to use the Susan Buckmore's terminology, how is minimalist sculpture sustaining the critical moment of aesthetic experience? Now, what Krauss does is substitute for that. Instead of sustaining the critical moment of aesthetic experience, it's about a cultural critique. And it's a cultural critique of art. So it's a critique of art as a cultural category, as a merely conventional, institutional cultural category. Which again has a paradoxical or ambiguous character to it. That could be either leaning in an anti-aesthetic direction, or it could be some kind of attempt to preserve the aesthetic as against the merely cultural category of art. The thing with the October writers is that they're always going to be taking these artists and using them to prove their kind of critical point. They're always going to be taking the artists as exemplifying their kind of more theoretical or critical agenda. We're going to see that she does this with Sherry Levine. Douglas Crimp will do it with Daniel Buren. Like they have a very tendentious reading of the artist's work. to fulfill their kind of critical agenda, which may or may not be true or abusive with respect to the actual artworks. So again, Fried got into very close detail with Donald Judd and Robert Morris and Tony Smith about how they were struggling with sculpture as a category and what they were trying to do. And Krauss is doing more like, oh, okay, Fried says this isn't sculpture, and so I'm going to say instead what it is. And then she sort of maps the artist's work onto her kind of theoretical framework. And her theoretical framework is the structuralist account of culture. So in other words, she turns this into a criticism of art along her lines. Whereas Fried was actually trying to struggle more in terms of how the artists themselves were struggling with the categories of art.
Did Rosalyn Krauss directly get the structuralism stuff from Levi-Strauss, or did she get
Yes.
it from
Both. Hodgepodge. We'll see. Bart and Foucault, who we're reading next week, also have an influence as well. But Levi-Strauss for sure, yeah. Okay, I've kept you guys too late. Have a good weekend, have a good evening, and I'll see you guys next week.